If we decide to do this thing, we can do it successfully. And there's also no doubt in my mind that the whole world hangs in the balance.
Thank you very much for being here. And you're not here really to hear me talk. You're here to hear me talk about George Marshall and his relationships with these three other interesting gentlemen. And let me start with a little truth in advertising here. I'm not a Marshall specialist or even a Marshall biographer. In fact, the reason I got into military history is I'm easily bored. So I can bounce around. I can write about Romans, I can write about World War II, I can write about guided missiles, you name it. I wrote once an intellectual history of weapons. I wrote a book about the origins of war. So I'm hardly a specialist in this stuff. And I've never really, I did come out here once with all good intention of spending at least 2 weeks in the archives reading this stuff, but then COVID basically put me in my house, and then for a while the Alderman Library at UVA was helping me out, but then they not only did they have trouble with COVID, but they closed for renovations, and they took the entire collection and put it in a warehouse. So I found myself sort of, I've got this couch that a friend of mine used to sell furniture in Charlottesville. He sold me a nice couch. And I sat upstairs in a loft and wrote this thing day after day, week after week through the pandemic. And it seemed to work out pretty well. But once again, I come to you not as a Marshall specialist, but somebody who became very interested in Marshall. And I think I have something to say about him. If you're charitable, you might even call them insights. I'm not sure. But something. And perhaps you'll disagree vociferously, and we can have a talk afterwards. He's hardly an easy man to know. One of the things I speak about in this book is the concept that John Keegan, who was the greatest military historian of my generation, talked about in a book he simply titled The Mask of Command. And I picked up on that metaphor because the thing is, you got to realize the general is really faced with a tough problem. And that is, by his very presence, people have to obey you and stuff like that, but by his very presence, you have to convince people to do things crazy like risk their lives. And that's hard. To inspire people at that level is a rare trick. And these guys all had it to one degree or another. What's interesting about the four of them is, and I would maintain, you can argue with me, that these were the four greatest generals in U.S. history that ever served together. And maybe the four greatest in history. They were good. And the more I got to know about them and realized just how good they were, the more admiration I had for all four of them. But it's ironic that two of them were never in combat, Eisenhower and Marshall. And people made a distinction. One of them was Douglas MacArthur, who always sort of looked down on these guys, and Patton did too. You know, they were the killers. These guys were the office boys. That's hardly true. All four were extremely courageous and took big risks during World War II. Marshall, after the Second Cairo Conference, when he learned that he wasn't going to get the command he wanted in Normandy, he decided, rather than just to slink home, he decided to go the Pacific way and visit, of all people, Douglas MacArthur, whom he hated. And this is right after his stepson is killed in Italy. So this is like the lowest point in this guy's career. And, you know, this dude would carry on. I mean, and he went out to visit MacArthur. But on the way, MacArthur lent a plane to him, a four-engine transport. But these things didn't have any radar, and they weren't pressurized, so they flew low. And literally, there was a bolt of lightning in front of the plane just in time to realize that they were about to fly into a cliff. And that would have been the end of George Marshall for sure. Although I didn't get much of a welcome from MacArthur. MacArthur left, actually, and Marshall had to chase him down. And they had a very frosty lunch when he was introducing the members of the staff. And George Marshall had a very dry sense of humor, and he said, you don't really have a staff. What you have is a coterie. And it was true. But MacArthur said, I need more resources. I've got to have more planes. And that's the first thing George Marshall did when he got back to Washington, is got MacArthur those planes. He was the ultimate team player. At one point, talking about Marshall and trying to figure out what sort of guy he is, it's hardly easy. One of my favorite quotes from Marshall is, I saved my emotions for Mrs. Marshall. That's a telling quote, especially when you consider that his first wife of 20 years, Lily, had a chronic and ultimately fatal heart condition that likely kept things pretty tepid domestically. Granted, his second wife, Catherine, was more lively, if more tragic. She suffered actually more from bullets than actually George Marshall did, because her husband was a lawyer, a prominent lawyer in Baltimore, and a crazy client. He was in his one Saturday working. This crazy client came and shot him, killed him. And she met Marshall shortly after that. And then her son, Alan, George Marshall got him into tanks, and he was killed in a tank during World War II. So she had a tough time. And yet, outside of his family also, George Marshall had very few really intimate friends. In fact, I probably would boil them down to just two. One was an important one, Blackjack Pershing. Now, most may be familiar with John Pershing, but he was the head of the American Expeditionary Force in Europe. And that was an extraordinarily hard job, because when we declared war on Germany in the spring of 1917, we didn't really have an army. And we had to put it together on the fly. Our arms program never worked, and we had to use pretty much French and English weapons, but they had a lot of them by that time. But none of the troops were trained up for combat, and it was Pershing's job to really put that together. There's a famous quote when he arrived that was actually said by someone who was staff, Lafayette, we have returned. But in this case, they returned with a bunch of guys who weren't really combat soldiers, and it was Pershing that had to put this together, and he was always in a bad mood. He's Blackjack Pershing in part because he commanded a bunch of Buffalo soldiers in his earlier career. But he was Blackjack in part because he was in El Paso. No. Where was it? He was at a big base in Texas, and there was this, shortly before the United States got into war in Europe, there was a military expedition to chase down Pancho Villa, which wasn't very successful. But anyway, while he was doing that, he got word, he'd left his wife and and his family in San Francisco. And he got word the barracks that they were living in burned down and they were all dead. No, one son survived, but the rest were dead. And so anyway, in fact, that was one way Pershing worked his way into Blackjack's good offices too, because he had an attractive sister that Blackjack eventually got engaged to. But Pershing really liked Marshall. And one of the things that tells you something about Marshall's character is he became friends with Marshall, or not friends, but really associates, when he came desperately trying to get Marshall's division in some sort of combat order and just chewed out the general in charge. And Marshall at this point is a lieutenant colonel. And he says, wait a second, you can't tell my general that. You know, we're working as hard as we can. And Pershing turns around and Marshall reaches out and stops him with his hand. This is a lieutenant colonel. I mean, there's an unwritten rule in the military. You never touch a commanding officer or really anybody. And he did this. And that, you know, that was a career ender, but not for Blackjack Pershing. He took it as a moment of dedication. This guy is afraid of nobody in power, and he's somebody I want to watch. And it was beneath his mighty wings that George Marshall managed to move his career forward. Marshall wasn't exactly a suck-up, as you'll see, but he was a man of deep loyalty. And so that was one of his friends. The other was Harry Hopkins, who was President Roosevelt's most intimate advisor. And they shared, again, a bond of sorrow in that Harry Hopkins' son was killed in World War II too. But again, it tells something about Marshall because, you know, Harry Hopkins was President Roosevelt's most intimate advisor, and Blackjack Pershing was more influential than anybody else in the Army through the period that Marshall's career was rising. So he was a good guy, a principled guy, but a shrewd guy too. Now, the lack of, he was essentially, I would say, a functional, not an empathetic or inspirational human being. Beyond getting the job done, there was really didn't seem to me to be a lot more of George left. Still, when you consider what he accomplished, that's plenty. Things like building and presiding over the U.S. Army that won World War II, playing the invisible hand behind the Manhattan Project that brought forth the bomb that destined to change everything, restoring the prosperity of Western Europe with a plan that bears his name, and then winning the Nobel Peace Prize in the bargain. Of course, when they give a peace prize to a soldier, sometimes it's a problem, and in fact, fighting broke out at the ceremony for George's Nobel Peace Prize, but that's beside the point. Basically, what I want to tell you is I think George Marshall was essentially a genius at telling people what to do, ordering them around in not just large, but astronomical numbers, eventually in the millions. Given his coldest fish personality, there might well be a temptation in the contemporary environment to categorize him as computer-like. Actually, he was more nearly the opposite. The central virtue of computers is an ability to deal with massive amounts of data at the speed of light. Marshall's genius was to ignore the details and dump them on those he trusted. He was a master of delegation. And because his gaze only caught the largest issues, he became exceptionally good at setting priorities and developing almost a Zen-like bureaucratic awareness. Subordinates were inevitably ridden with a very loose hand, but then occasionally and unpredictably jerked back into awareness of who was ultimately in charge. Let me give you an example. Consider the case of General Leslie Groves, whom Marshall had chosen to run the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb, on the grounds that he managed to build the Pentagon, the world's largest office building. On this occasion, Grove went to Marshall's office to ask for an extra $100 million, which in today's money is about $18 billion. He sat down, and the general was concentrating on filling out what appeared to be a form. And minutes went by, Marshall never looked up. Finally he did. And he said, "You may have wondered why I kept you waiting. Well, I was writing out an order to Burpee for flower seeds to the total of $3.94. Now, Groves got his money, but he left the office knowing where he stood. He did this to Patton repeatedly. He loved to jerk Patton around. There was one incident after Tobruk where the British were in sorry shape, and we had some M1 tanks that were just coming off the assembly line. And Roosevelt said, "Well, we'll give you a division of those tanks." So Patton was out at the Desert Training Center in California, and he called Patton in and said, "Look, it looks like we may go." This is before North Africa. "We may have to go with a division. I want you to lead the division, and I want you to plan this out." So Patton comes back the next day to Marshall, and he said, "First thing I want to tell you, General, I need 2 divisions." And Marshall said, "That's interesting." He picked up a phone and said, "Would you come in? I want you to escort Colonel Patton out to the airport. He's flying back to the Desert Training Center." Patton thought he was going to be there forever, and Marshall wouldn't accept it. He was pretty friendly with Marshall. At one point, Marshall was just moving into his house at Fort Belvoir at the Chief of Staff's, and Patton, because he was in the cavalry, he had a house at the same location, and he invited Marshall to stay with him, and they lived together for maybe 6 months. But it didn't matter, and in the end, Marshall jerked him back, and finally, after many calls, he looked up to his subordinate and said, "That's the way you treat Patton." He tried the same thing with Eisenhower. Now, Ike liked Ike, the nickname. He loved being called Ike. Everybody called him Ike. Mamie called him Ike. All his friends called him Ike. Sometimes he'd tell perfect strangers, "Call me Ike." Marshall only called him Eisenhower. Always, except once he slipped and called him Ike. And Eisenhower recounted he never heard such a barrage of "Eisenhower, do this, Eisenhower, do that, Eisenhower here, come over here, Eisenhower." He said he must have said it 150 times in an hour. But Ike saw right through him, too. Now, we shouldn't make too much of this, because the important part of this was not jerking these people back. It was the loose hand to begin with, giving subordinates plenty of freedom to operate independently, in fact, insisting on it. Those who proved incapable of taking the initiative were gone in short order. He was ruthless. And he could be, because he was ultimately, he identified so much with the United States and its welfare and the building of the army that he could afford psychologically to be very, very ruthless. So you probably heard of the Louisiana games or Louisiana maneuvers. As a result of that, he lopped off most of the command structure, and this is when Patton and Eisenhower and Mark Clark and a number of others that he had picked out earlier as the ones in his so-called black book. Somebody will ask me probably, was there a black book? I never saw it. Is it somewhere here, secretly held, not to be opened for 1,000 years? Who knows? But I think it was a way of him saying, I've got a number of people who have impressed me over the years, and if I ever get into command here, these are the people I'm going to be leaning on. And they were. He wasn't always right, but he was a very, very good judge of character. And one thing that, how did he arrive at this state? And one of the things that is true about George Marshall, at the core, he was a team player. And this began here in Lexington. Actually, he arrived town to attend a VMI, fueled by his brother Stuart's assessment that George's matriculation could only bring disgrace on the Marshall family name. Since Stuart was a recent grad of the school, this carried some weight, at least with George, who never forgot it. It's probably no accident that Stuart had dated Lily before George Marshall ended up marrying her. And really, I mean, this was not a fundamental character trait, but he was really anxious to get back at his brother for whatever reason. I never really understood that, and they were never really reconciled. But anyway, even more important is what George Marshall found in the rat line and in the Corps Cadets at VMI, because he found not only a comfort in a sense of purpose in the aggregate of people, but he discovered that he was meant to wear the mask of command. And he was elevated to the highest rank of first captain before he graduated, despite the fact that he was not a particularly good student. This was just, he got this because he was George Marshall. Well, George Marshall may have found his destiny in Lexington, but his destiny hadn't exactly found him. The problem was almost nobody at that point, especially during peacetime, graduates of VMI simply didn't get commissions in the U.S. Army. They generally tended to become successful businessmen in Virginia, actually. But Marshall was determined to do this, and he waged what might be called his first strategic campaign to get into the Army. This reached its final kind of crescendo when he walked into the White House, sort of unobtrusively got into a group of people that were going to visit, I believe, President William Howard Taft. And as he got in there, he stepped aside and said, "I'm a graduate of VMI. I really need a commission." Now, this didn't work out for George, actually, but it shows you his degree of commitment and, you know, luck, because after the Spanish-American War, they were increasing the officer corps, and he was able to get in. And so he was on his way towards the history books. He was in the U.S. Army. That took a while, around 50 years, before he became what he ultimately would be. However, something happened early in his career to me that so epitomized the identity that he eventually assumed that it almost serves as a prophecy. In 1914, now First Lieutenant George Marshall was ordered to the Philippines and found himself under the command of an affable but drunken colonel. Now, complicating this matter, especially for the tipsy officer, was he was assigned to be head of a massive war game as the invading force. An amphibious operation is the hardest military thing to do. And here this guy is drunk most of the time. Not only that, but he'd forgotten to order sufficient landing craft. And the umpires wanted him sacked, which is a career ender. Into this breach stepped First Lieutenant Marshall, offering to run the entire operation, while keeping the colonel in charge, saving both his face and his eagles. Once the other colonels got used to accepting orders from a first lieutenant, they came to marvel at their clarity and precision. Not only that, but Marshall seemed to have an uncanny grasp of the entire operation that nobody else did. He managed nonstop for 2 weeks while working 14, 16-hour days, culminating when his force successfully reached their objective. Now, this didn't go unnoticed, because this was, and in his efficiency report, one superior wrote, "There are not 5 officers in the Army as well qualified to command a division in the field." That's a major general slot, 2 slars. He's a first lieutenant. So somebody thought he was pretty talented. It's also true that all officers prize loyalty. And George Marshall, in protecting his commander, had shown himself to be a stand-up guy. That kind of stuff doesn't get forgotten. It doesn't get written necessarily in efficiency reports, but it gets passed on. He also collapsed immediately after, suffering what we would call a nervous breakdown, spending 2 weeks in the hospital and several months recuperating. It was at this point that George Marshall realized he was easily capable of working himself to death. Now, as I'll say later, George Marshall was a fundamentally honest man, even with himself. So in a very Marshall-like way, he took remedial action. He got in shape, began regular horse riding. But above all, he carefully regulated his work hours. From this point forward, George Marshall was anything but a workaholic. While on duty, he was the most intense of men, allowing his subordinates no small talk, not even a polite hello. What you did is, you walked into his office, you sat down in a chair facing him, his head was down. The minute he looked up, he expected you in less than a minute to tell him why he was there. He didn't care even who you were. But he might ask you, but no small talk, no nothing. He'd say something like, "I got it," and then you're out. And that's the way he acted. But not past 5. Except in rare cases like wartime summits. Marshall was a man that knew the mask of command was mostly just for banker's hours. I like that. He knew how to relax, and I'm suggesting that was an important source of his balance and steady leadership. People work too much. You know, you can overwork and lose all perspective. Marshall didn't do that. He stepped back. I think really at this early day we have a reasonable facsimile of the ultimate George Marshall. But of all his qualities, the one I find most interesting, and the one I mentioned a while back, was his fundamental honesty. He was honest with himself. He was fundamentally an honest man. He always tried to tell the truth. But the problem is he was involved in politics. He was involved in wartime Washington, where a lot of stuff was cloaked in secrecy. So, nonetheless, Marshall was able to go nobody was a greater critic of this, of people trying to sell him a bill of goods, than Senator Harry Truman, who ran the Senate Committee on Waste, Fraud, and Abuse. And he got very good at asking the right questions. And with Marshall, he loved Marshall. Marshall always gave him a straight story, except when he didn't. He talked to Truman endlessly and never mentioned the word Manhattan, except maybe he mentioned the city Manhattan. I don't know about that. And his trust inspired true bipartisan support. Marshall was a man who could go before anybody during World War II and be believed, which made his pronouncements almost oracular. And when Harry Truman became president and learned about the significance of the Manhattan, he never held it against Marshall. He understood. what the situation was, and he never thought Marshall was anything less than an honest man. Now let's flash forward to nearly the end of George Marshall's career. Well after his unsuccessful mission to China and subsequent to the communist takeover there in 1949, and just subsequent to the North Korean invasion of the South in late June 1950. Determined to resist, Harry Truman called Marshall back from retirement for a second time. And the first time, he let him retire for almost a day before he called him back and sent him to China. This one, he had like a couple months off. Anyway, he wanted to be Secretary of Defense, which was a new job, and the previous secretary had not done well. Forrestal had committed suicide, and the one in between didn't want to go, and I'm sorry, I forgot his name. But basically, Marshall said, look, quote, they're charging me with the downfall of Chiang's government in China. I want to help, not hurt you. And Marshall told that to Truman, and Truman persisted and actually wrote his wife Bess, can you think of anyone else that would say that to me? I can't, and he's one of the greats. And that's actually how Harry Truman thought of George Marshall, and I think that provoked Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a pretty affable guy, but he really came to hate Truman. And I think part of it was he was jealous because Truman so obviously favored Marshall. But that's just, once again, that's one of my, quote, insights. We're not sure if that's totally true. But anyway, he was not one of the greats, according to his radical Republican opponents in Congress. Even Marshall was probably surprised by the venom of Senator William Jenner of Indiana, soon to become the other member of Senator Joe McCarthy's tag team dedicated to finding communists under every rock, even if they were not there, perpetuating the big lie that they really were the most concerted assault on the truth prior to the events surrounding the last presidential election and the effort to overturn its results. His statement that day was, George Marshall is not only willing, he is eager to play the front man for traitors. The truth is this, it's no new role for him. George Marshall is a living lie. These words speak for themselves, and they are instructive. When demagogues seek to undermine the system, their first targets are the truth and truth tellers. That's how they stifle legitimacy and seek to overturn the political order. George Marshall became their target less for what he did than for what he stood for. For an honest man, by his very existence, is tyranny's worst enemy. Having said that, where are we? What do we, I thought I might read do you want to hear a passage from this book? Is that okay? And then maybe we'll open it up for questions. Is that okay? Okay. This book made me quit history. I realized that it was going over fairly well. I got out clean. The publisher wasn't mad at me. I figured it's time to leave. I was in the CVS getting a prescription. I picked up one of these glossy things about the singer Billy Joel. And apparently in 2015, he finished his last album, and it was really going over well, won a lot of awards. And he said he was walking down the street, and he heard a distinct voice in his head go, "Just shut up." And from that time on, he's never published any new material. He'll play the old material in concerts, and he's published some classical music stuff, but nothing more. And, you know, he's a lot more famous than me, so God had to say, you know, just shut up. Me just gave me kind of a feeling it was over, you know, so anyway, this, I think, gets it the power of Marshall. This is a confrontation between him and Winston Churchill. And the idea behind this is a trap that Marshall set for Churchill. The trap is unified command. The idea that in each theater, the Allies would have one single unified command, and he was going to name the first unified command General Wavell, who was a British guy. But basically the deal was, as the Americans got more and more powerful, it would become more and more inevitable that Americans would be in charge. So anyway, Marshall had more or less sold this to the underlings, and he had to go and sell it to Winston Churchill. And this is where it starts out. He found him late in the morning of December 27th, propped up in bed, clad only in a Chinese dragon bathrobe, smoking a cigar, and a scotch and soda at the ready. His natural habitat until lunch. He was not in a good mood, but that didn't deter Marshall, who rattled off his proposal, pacing in front of the bed. When Churchill interrupted, asking what a general like Wavell knew about fighting a ship, which was a very special thing, Marshall shot back, "What the devil did a naval officer know about handling a tank?" That was completely besides the point, as Marshall recalled. I told him I was not interested in Drake and Frobisher. I was interested in having a united front against Japan, an enemy which was fighting furiously. I said if we didn't do something right away, we were finished in the war. Ask yourself, if you're Churchill, who is he talking about when he says we? It was at that point that the Prime Minister ended the meeting and retreated to his toilet. The steam coming off the tub may not have been just from hot water. Winston Churchill, the world's best arguer, had just been thrashed, and he must have known it. The innocent-sounding unity of command was loaded with significance. The Americans were giving it to Wavell now, but inevitably, as their numbers and weight of arms grew, he would have to give it back, and the Americans would be supremos. Worse still, even though Churchill saw it coming, he would have to accede to George Marshall's proposals, though it was unsaid and unseen that George Marshall held the diplomatic equivalent of a Louisville slugger. From the British point of view, the central achievement of Arcadia Conference was to get the Americans to commit to a Europe First game plan, which Marshall was certainly for, thereby ensuring their own survival. But now this tough-talking American was demanding a quid pro quo, the bat's unmistakable implications being that if Marshall didn't get what he wanted, he would be willing to listen to the American people and turn towards the Pacific to seek revenge they wanted first. Churchill, above all things, was a realist, and so it would be Europe first and unity of command. Although George Marshall had hit the equivalent of a walk-off homer, a game winner against his best pitch, Churchill never held it against him. It's been said that one trait of greatness is being able to recognize it in others. Something like that seems to have transpired in this case. At any rate, from this moment, Winston Churchill always treated George Marshall with the greatest respect. So that's kind of a little bit of it.